series. We're going to be focusing on impairment of financial assets in this video lecture, and specifically we're going to be dealing with the different impairment approaches. So I hope you've taken note of the syllabus scope as well as the scope in your IAS 32 and your IFRS 9. So the lecture objectives of this particular video, so we're going to be dealing with impairment, and we said impairment approaches in particular. So there are two impairment approaches that are prescribed by your IFRS 9, which is your general approach and your simplified approach. So we're going to break down these two approaches so that you have an understanding of these approaches in this video. So with your general approach, it focuses on the change in credit quality of your financial asset, right? So it then breaks down your impairment into 3 stages based on the credit quality of your financial asset. So if you have no significant increase in credit risk, so in this case you're basically saying you have a low credit risk, right? Low risk of default on your financial asset. This then says, okay, we've identified, so you've actually then identified the credit quality of your financial asset. So the stages are then going to inform you of, once you've actually identified your credit quality, how are you going to measure your impairment loss, right? So these are the 3 stages, and we're going to go through them one by one. So your first stage, we're saying your stage 1, we're saying there is no significant increase in credit risk. So in your stage 1, you're saying you have low credit risk. I hope from the previous video you know what credit risk is. It's basically your risk of financial loss or the risk of the borrower defaulting, right? So in stage 1, we're saying the risk of the borrower defaulting is low, right? So given that the risk of the borrower defaulting is low, how are we going to measure our impairment loss or our expected credit loss, right? So to measure expected credit loss, we're going to say we're going to actually take into account, because the risk is lowest, we're going to say we don't expect, we're going to say we're going to measure our impairment just for the amounts that are due in the next 12 months, right? So expected credit loss allowance will be based on 12-month expected credit loss. So you're looking at your cash flows that are coming through in the next 12 months, and you're then recognizing those, right? So each stage identifies credit quality, and then it also identifies how you're going to measure your expected credit loss allowance. And on top of that, it's going to then guide you in terms of, now, so this is a financial asset, and you're going to have your coupon and your interest, remember? So in determining your interest revenue, which we did in the first video, the calculation of your interest revenue will be the same. It will be based on the carrying amount of your financial asset, which is basically what they're referring to when they say gross basis. So this is your stage 1. So I hope you've taken note of that for each stage. So starting from stage 1, you need to take note of the credit quality of your financial asset. So in this case, we're saying we have low credit risk, and then moving from there, you can then determine how you're going to measure your expected credit loss allowance. So if we're saying our risk is low, we're going to then just impair cash flows that we're expecting in the next 12 months. And this stage also then provides guidance on how you need to measure interest revenue on your financial asset, and we say this is in line with measurement that we dealt with in the second video when we dealt with measurement of financial assets. So that's what they mean when they say calculate your interest revenue on gross basis. They're basically saying calculate on the carrying amount in your books, isn't it? So let's move on to our stage 2. So what are the 3 things that I said you need to then take note of? You need to look at the quality. One, you need to look at the quality of the credit quality of your financial asset. So in stage 2, we are saying that there's been a significant increase in credit risk, right? Which means that it's now more risky. And then in terms of the second thing we said, you then look at is how you're going to measure your expected credit loss allowance. And we said this is based on the credit quality that you'd have assessed in the first point. So we said there's significant increase in credit risk. So when we're measuring impairment, we now need to look at all the cash flows going forward from today until the day the financial asset matures, which therefore means your expected credit loss allowance will be for the lifetime. So there will be your expected credit losses will be lifetime expected credit losses. So you're looking at contractual cash flows through the lifetime of your financial asset, and then your interest revenue will still be calculated on gross basis. And it goes back to the measurement video that we dealt with when we were doing financial assets, right? So your gross basis, if you go to your module, I'm sure your gross basis tells you that the gross basis is the carrying amount of the financial asset, right? And then in the third, when we get to stage 3, they're going to say calculate on the net basis, and your net basis will be amortized cost, which we're saying you're now taking into account the gross carrying amount of your asset, and you're removing any expected credit loss allowance. So in stage 1 and stage 2, you do not then deduct your expected credit loss allowances from your carrying amount when you're trying to determine the interest that you should raise on your interest revenue, you should raise on your financial asset, right? So let's move on to stage 3. Your stage 3 deals with credit impaired financial assets, and this is at awareness level. If it's not excluded in your syllabus, just refer to the scope document that I spoke about earlier. So with your stage 3 with your financial assets in stage 3, you're saying that it has now been credit impaired, meaning that probably your borrower is not performing as expected in terms of that they've actually probably missed payments, and you're now not expecting them to probably pay you, right? So when you now get to this stage, determination of your expected credit loss allowance will also be on lifetime expected credit losses, and then you're going to calculate your interest revenue on the net basis. So with the net basis, we're saying you're carrying amount in the books, and then you less any expected credit losses like your impairments that you've raised, and then you calculate your interest revenue on that. So each stage guides your determination of credit quality, and then how you're going to measure your expected credit loss allowance. So that's basically what your stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3 deals with. So your general approach, like I was saying earlier, deals with impairment of your financial assets based on their credit quality, right? So if your credit quality is, we're saying your credit, so where your credit quality, when we're assessing your credit quality and we say you have low credit risk, that falls into your stage 1. And then if we're assessing your credit quality and we're saying there's been a significant increase in credit risk, that falls into your stage 2. And then stage 3 is basically saying you're now credit impaired. So those are the stages in terms of your general approach. And then your general approach then says how are you going to measure your impairment losses. It's either at 12 months or at lifetime. So we're going to get into our definitions of expected credit loss, what's 12 month, what's lifetime, because I just described them briefly earlier. So, expected credit losses is the weighted average of credit losses with respective risks of default occurring as the weight. So you're basically looking at the contractual cash flows that you're expecting to receive, and then you're looking at the risk associated with each contractual cash flow, and then you're then weighting it. Do you remember what you're saying, am I expecting to receive it? Maybe there's a chance, 30% chance I won't receive, 40 that I will receive late and whatnot. So you're then now waiting to come up with your expected credit loss. This is the loss that you're then going to recognize in your financial statements. Okay, so when measuring your expected credit loss, you need to make sure that it's unbiased and probability weighted, and it's evaluating the range of possible outcomes. What is the likelihood of you not receiving the payment? What is the likelihood of you receiving the payment? So you're then weighting those likelihoods to come up with your expected credit loss. It also needs to then take into account time value of money. Your financial asset has contractual cash flows over its lifetime, and it's probably going to have you're probably going to get cash flows. Let's say you have a financial asset that will mature in 5 years. You need to then take into account time value of money. The cash you're receiving this year compared to next year and 3 years from now, when you're trying, is completely different. $1 today is not equivalent to $1 3-4 years down the line, right? You then also need to make sure you're using reasonable and supportable information that is available without undue cost or effort, right? So you then look at you can then use your information, financial statements, previous information on defaulting, and then you focused going forward as long as it's not costly to you. So expected credit loss should not be calculated at getting the inputs should not be very costly, so you can't incur undue cost in terms of measuring your expected credit losses. So let's now move into determining and into defining your 12-month expected losses. So your 12-month expected losses are the portion of lifetime expected credit losses that represent the expected credit losses that result from default events on a financial instrument that are possible within 12 months after the reporting date. So you're saying you have your financial asset and you're receiving, let's say, 10,000 yearly, right? So maybe we're at 31 December 2019. So your 12-month expected losses will be like, what losses would you expect in the next 12 months? If our payments are 10,000 per year, we're saying you're now expecting the losses that you'd expect in the next 12 months will be the 10,000, not the entire, let's say, 40,000 remaining, because the remaining, so what's due in the next year will be 10,000, and then a year 3-4 will be 10,000, 10,000, 10,000. So when we're saying the risk of default in the next 12 months, we're just looking at what amounts are due in the next 12 months, and then you then calculate your expected losses based on the amounts due in the next 12 months. So your links back to your stage 1 where we're saying there hasn't been a significant increase in credit risk, so we're saying your credit risk is low. And remember, in stage 1 you said you calculate your expected credit losses based on 12-month expected losses. So your 12-month expected losses will then be, you're expecting the 10,000 in the year. So at year end, when you're now trying to come up with your 12-month expected losses, you then need to present value the 10,000 that's due in the next year to come up with the value that you say I should then pay at 31 December 2019, right? So when a 12-month expected credit loss is recognized, this takes us back to our stages that we identified earlier. So it would be an initial recognition, because the moment you give out a loan to someone, would you give out a loan to someone that is highly risky? Probably not. So on day one, on initial recognition, your credit risk is most certainly low, right? Because you're not going to be giving a loan to someone who's very risky. So your 12-month expected losses will be on initial recognition or when the credit risk presented by the financial instrument is low. So we're saying there hasn't been a change in credit risk since initial recognition. You're still expecting that the risk of default on contractual payments is low. Or when the credit risk presented by the financial instrument has not significantly increased since initial recognition or previous reporting date. So this basically sounds the same as the second point to confirm. So that's when you actually recognize your 12-month expected credit losses. And this is in line with your stage 1. Okay, so now let's move on to our lifetime expected losses. So your lifetime expected losses is the expected credit losses that result from all possible default events over the expected life of a financial instrument. So let's get back to our financial instrument. We've acquired it January 2019, right? And then at the end of 2019, 31 December 2019, we're trying to say, okay, so what is our lifetime expected loss? So you now look at all the outstanding contractual cash flows, right? So those are the amounts that you're expecting to be defaulted on. In contrast with the 12-month, you're looking at how much money, how much in terms of contractual cash flows am I expecting to receive in the next 12 months. In the lifetime, we're saying you're actually looking at all the contractual cash flows that you're expecting to receive for the financial asset until a date of maturity, and then you raise your impairment on the on these expected contractual cash flows. So confirm it makes sense that when it's now more risky, if your credit risk has significantly increased and you're saying the lending to my borrower paying me back is now really risky, you now need to take into account the entire amount they owe you and then say, okay, how much should I impair it back, because now they're very risky and there is a risk that I'm not going to receive the amounts that are due to me, is it? So when a lifetime expected credit loss is recognized, so like we said earlier, remember with your lifetime, it's now falling into your stage 2 and your stage 3. So with your lifetime, you're saying you will recognize them if credit risk presented by financial instrument is no longer low. So the moment if you're going to be lending money to someone, you lend if you expect them to pay you back. So if it's low, you're not going to need to impair it over the lifetime. But the moment that is no longer low and there's now a risk that the person that owes you is not going to pay, you now need to look at my cash flows going forward until the maturity of the financial asset are now at risk. So I need to now recognize and my expected credit loss over the lifetime of the financial asset, or if the credit risk presented by the financial instrument has significantly increased since initial recognition or previous reporting date. So we've been talking about, there's low credit risk and apply your stage 1, and now there's significant credit risk, apply your stage 2 and stage 3, right? So how do you get to the conclusion that there's been a significant increase in credit risk and now I need to measure my expected credit losses as lifetime expected credit losses? So your IFRS 9 gives you guidance. I would like you guys to go to your IFRS 9 para 5.5.9 to 5.5.11 and also go to your appendix B and look at these paragraphs, right? So like we said, why is it important? Why are we looking at as your credit risk increased significantly, because we said under the general approach you're going to recognize your loss allowance on all financial assets within the scope of the financial assets, except, remember, trade receivables with a significant financing component. If the credit risk has increased significantly since initial recognition, you need to measure the loss allowance at an amount equal to your lifetime expected credit losses. But if the credit risk has not increased significantly, you need to measure, meaning it's low, you need to measure your loss allowance at an amount equal to the 12-month expected credit losses. So in this case, can you see your general approach is saying you need to look at, is your credit risk low or has it significantly increased? Which means you need to know, like, pick out the indicators of, has the credit risk significantly increased? So how do you assess whether there is a significant change in credit risk since initial recognition? So you need to then find reasonable and supportable forward-looking information, because you're trying to assess whether your borrower is going to pay you back in the years to come, right? So, and the information has to be available without undue cost or effort, and the information will need to give you an indication of the credit risk associated with your borrower. So, the methods of assessing qualitative methods of assessing increase in credit risk is, so we've got a couple of examples. If you start with low credit risk, there's a greater chance that as time goes on, there might be an increase in credit risk, which could be significant equity. If your credit risk is going to change going forward, it's probably going to change upwards, right? And usually, if you lend out money for extended periods, confirm it's more risky. That's why you find people charging higher interests for financial assets with a longer life than those with short life. So the moment your financial asset has a longer life, there's a risk that there will be a significant increase in credit risk, right? Risk of default decreases with time unless if the majority of the payment needs to be made in future. So the more you have payments that need to be made in future, the more likely that you're going to have significant credit risk, right? So what are the other indicators of increasing credit risk? So let's say there's the person that you're borrowing to, there's a change to their business, financial or economic conditions. Look at Zimbabwe, right? The way the economy is going right now, right? If you had lent to someone at the beginning of the year, look at the way the prices are increasing and whatnot. It means they have less disposable income, which means that it's likely that there will be an increase in their credit risk. So I want you to go back and think of other examples where you're saying, oh, this is an indicator that there is an increase in credit risk. So the customer maybe now has new competitors and they're losing market share. What is the likelihood that they're going to pay? Maybe they'll still pay, but then the risk that they might not pay has increased. Also look at profitability. Maybe cost of production have gone up and now they're less profitable or they're even making losses. What is the likelihood of them paying you? So risk of them not paying has increased, which shows that there's been a significant increase in your credit risk. So that's it for your general approach. So with general approach, just to summarize it, please take note of that you need to assess credit quality of the financial asset, and assessing credit quality of the financial asset will then guide you in determining how you will measure your expected credit loss. Right. So now moving on to the simplified approach. With your simplified approach, there are no stages, right? We're basically saying you're going to actually measure your loss allowance based on the lifetime. So this would apply to your trade receivables and contract assets with no no significant financing component, or maybe there's a significant financing component, but the entity has chosen to apply the lifetime approach, which means, and you could also choose to apply the lifetime approach for your lease receivables. This is in your standard, so go to your standard and look at simplified approach and which type of financial assets can actually apply the simplified approach. This is very simple because you're basically measuring your impairment loss or your expected credit loss based on the lifetime expected credit losses. You're saying how over the duration of this financial asset, like the time that it's owing from now and when it has to be settled. I'm actually then looking at those contractual cash flows and then basing my impairment on that. So I hope that you can now differentiate between your general approach and your simplified approach. Your general approach focuses more on credit quality, and your simplified approach just has one stage that just says when you're measuring your financial assets and you're looking at impairment, you just actually apply the lifetime approach. Okay, thank you for your time. I'm going to have, there are going to be 3 more videos that are going to be looking at application of the general approach, application of the simplified approach, and probably general entries. Thank you for your time.